이제 2일차 학술 프로그램을 시작하도록 하겠습니다.
Welcome to the second day of the 김대중 Peace Forum 2023. Good morning to you all. I hope that you had a good rest last night in this beautiful scenery. Once again, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Kim Kyung-mi, the MC for yesterday and today's event. Yesterday, we had 3 sessions and discussions as well as Q&A sessions. So we've talked about international cooperation. And today, in the second day, we will be talking about the new Cold War and exploration of global peace regime, new nationalism and peaceful solution to current economic and trade issues, the new Cold War and food and energy security, and the last session will be about the peace on the Korean Peninsula, a changed world, a new peace paradigm. And then after we go through all the sessions, we will have a roundtable talking about the youth, future, and peace. What has to be done? And then we will have lastly the ceremony for the Kim Dae-jung Book Award and the Kim Dae-jung Thesis Award, as well as the closing ceremony. So I hope you can stay with us until the very end and give us your insights. And now we would like to begin the 4th session with the title, The New Cold War and Exploration of Global Peace Regime. And we have our moderator, Mr. Paik Haksoon, who is the board member of the Kim Dae-jung Peace Center. Welcome him with a big round of applause. And then we have our 2 presenters. We have Mr. Hyun, the former Korean ambassador to the UN. Welcome. And we have Mr. James Lindsay, the senior vice president of the Council on Foreign Relations. Please give him a big round of applause. Yes, so now I'd like to hand over the mic to Mr. Paik Haksoon, who is the moderator.
Session on day 2 of Kim Dae-jung Peace Forum 2023. I hope all of you enjoyed speeches and discussions yesterday. For those who missed the yesterday's keynote speech, opening ceremony, keynote speeches, and session speeches, I hope you will have the time to visit YouTube to watch and benefit. This session 4, and the title, the topic of this session is the new Cold War and the exploration of global peace regime. We all know that US-led international liberal order is in trouble, much more so than before. Even people are saying it is collapsing. And we are talking about the global West, global East, and the global South. But global East and global South, in particular, are not the East we knew, and not the so-called the third world we have long ignored. And so I don't want to characterize the current international power constellation in terms of the return of another Cold War or a new Cold War, because such terms tend to oversimplify and overgeneralize the current state of affairs in light of what we knew in the past, while things have changed a lot in uncharted waters. But some of the characteristics of current international relations points to the very representative or symptomatic kind of experience we had in the Cold War era. We have U.S.-China rivalry, and we have Russia, Ukraine, and NATO war in Europe, and we have the increased tension in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, and growing threat of war on the Korean Peninsula. Not a simple threat of war, but threat of a nuclear war here in Korea. So regardless of whether the new Cold War is a misnomer, we are just asking what is happening, how to explore and construct a a global peace regime under the circumstances? That's the question we are asking in this session. And so we are very fortunate to have two distinguished speakers, Ambassador Hyun and Senior Vice President of CFR, Dr. James Lindsay. Let me briefly introduce Ambassador Jo. Ambassador Jo was the Korean ambassador to the United Nations until June last year, right? June last year. And he served as the second and first vice president, vice minister of foreign affairs of the Republic of Korea in a row, very rare. He also served to India. He served, also his service included the postings as ambassador to India and Australia and permanent representative of Korea to the international organizations in Vienna. And also he was a deputy permanent representative to the United Nations. Of course, he posted to many other countries, including the United States and around the world. Ambassador Jo studied at Sciences Po in Paris and the Columbia University in New York, and he received his PhD in international relations from the University of Toulouse, France. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Jo. Oh, Ambassador Jo, not yet. Let me introduce Dr. Lindsay, and after that I will give you your time for speech. Dr. Lindsay is a senior vice president of the prestigious Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C., CFR. He's in charge of CFR's Washington office. He's a director of studies at CFR, and I would say that he is a leading authority on American foreign policy making process and domestic politics for American foreign policy. Dr. Lindsay taught at various schools, University of Texas at Austin, also at the University of Iowa. And he served the director for global issues and the multilateral affairs on the staff of National Security Council. And he was also at Harvard University at the, as the fellow at the Center for International Affairs. Dr. Lindsay authored, co-authored, and edited many books, as many as 15 books. And he was awarded, quite distinguished book prizes. Dr. Lindsay earned his PhD in political science from Yale University. Please welcome Senior Vice President Dr. Lindsay to this forum. We have 20 minutes each for your presentation, for your speeches. So now, Ambassador Jo, the floor is yours.
Professor Paik, thank you for your kind introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I would like to talk about three things. First, the world as I saw at the United Nations. Second, the prospects, my own prediction. And third, what to do to avoid war, particularly war in the Korean Peninsula. However, with your indulgence, I would like to do it in a rather extraordinary way, because I was just a junior diplomat at the time when President Kim Dae-jung was in the Blue House. I always wanted to make a personal report to him. So let me just take advantage of this occasion. So I will do it in this way. Professor Paik, you are President Kim Dae-jung. And I am reporting to you upon my arrival back from New York today. And let me start with a story I have, because I wanted to express my deep gratitude to President Kim Dae-jung. I was invited to a dinner by the Chinese ambassador to the United Nations, and there were a dozen of ambassadors, including the Italian ambassador. And at the table, out of blue, this host, the Chinese ambassador, said that, in fact, ravioli comes from dim sum of China, and spaghetti comes from Chinese noodle. They were all brought to Italy by Marco Polo. And this poor ambassador was at a loss what to say. And I immediately thought about, Mr. President, pay attention to me, about you, Mr. President. I thought about your article, your contribution to the Foreign Affairs magazine in November 1994. So I said, is there anybody who has not been to Paris Baguette, Paris Baguette in Manhattan? Nobody. Everybody goes there. And then I asked, is there anybody who knows that it's run by a Korean company? Nobody knew the fact. So I said that there are over 200 Paris Baguette branches in Beijing alone. So what I mean is that whether ravioli comes from dim sum or the other way around, what matters is the taste. As President Kim Dae-jung said, what matters is whether the government is serving its own people well or not. While arguing with Prime Minister Lee Kuan-yew in the previous session of Foreign Affairs, who argued that there is Asian culture, Asian values, President Kim Dae-jung said that there is no such thing as Asian value. It is often exploited by political leaders for their own personal purposes. What matters is whether the government is serving your people well or not. So that was it. I wanted to express my gratitude to you in person. Now, let me begin what's happening in New York. As you know well, the United Nations has become paralyzed because of Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, it has been dysfunctional for years because of the strategic rivalry between the United States and China. When I was there as Deputy Ambassador in 2006, China's budgetary contribution to the United Nations was mere the 7th. Now it's second, and it contributes 15% of the whole UN budget. The United States, only 22%. Is catching up. And accordingly, is trying to expand its power, wield its influence. As an example, China came up with GDI, Global Development Initiative. If you read it, it's innocuous, but there is conspicuous omission. There is no mention of human rights, no mention of environmental protection. So, in every committee, there is competition, strategic competition. But we all know that it's just a representation of this strategic rivalry at the United Nations. So, let me move on to my second subject, my own prediction on the future, near future. It's a difficult job to make any prediction. back in 2000, year 2000, when we were having this new millennium, I was at the OECD, and I had a chance of talking with a number of economists and strategists. And I asked them about the future. And this is the answer I got. Russia will become just one of us, Western Europe, just like Western European countries, a liberal democracy. China will go bust because of the deep divide between the coastal area and poor inner area. And also deeply debt-ridden government-running companies. And Japan will simply muddle through because it's impossible for them to go for reform. We all know that it has become all untrue, maybe except for Japan. So predicting something is very difficult, but I can assure you that my prediction is 100% sure. It will happen in this way. Why? Because it's the United States that said that the bilateral relationship between China and the US will be done cooperation, competition, and confrontation. So my prediction is that the world will depend on the combination of these three things: cooperation, competition, and confrontation. If cooperation between the two countries are big, it will be okay. If the confrontation is big, it will be precarious. Nevertheless, you have not reached at the level of modus operandi. So there will be continuation of turbulence. In my farewell dinner, I said to my colleague ambassadors that I said that if the planet were an airplane, this announcement from the captain will be coming out. We are entering into a turbulence. Fasten your seatbelt. Why? Because this strategic rivalry has crowded out the leadership of the United Nations and also the leadership of the United States. So there is a power vacuum. And we have seen most recently, only in a week time, the power vacuum, what the power vacuum leads to. In Nagorno-Karabakh, there are now 100,000 refugees. Why? Because there was a balance of power supported by Russia to Armenia. But as Russia has been preoccupied with Ukraine, Azerbaijan tried to take advantage of the situation. This is a typical case of things that happen in the vacuum. Nature abhors vacuum. Nature also hates too much of pressure. That is happening in the Korean Peninsula. So sometimes if there is too much of pressure, there is an explosion. Therefore, I am very worried about Korea, about the Korean Peninsula. So I want to seek the wisdom of President Kim Dae-jung. So, Professor Paik, you are now Ambassador Cho Hyun, okay? And I am President Kim Dae-jung. So with your understanding, I will say a few words of Kim Dae-jung. Well, Ambassador Cho, thank you for your report, and I share your concerns about the Korean Peninsula. My heart is aching when I see what's been happening in North Korea. It's not acceptable. Under the circumstances, however, the South Korean government has been focusing on two things. First, enhancing the deterrence, like Camp David trilateral talks. And secondly, stark warning against North Korea. I see some merits of them. Setting a clear red line sometimes works, but they are not sufficient measures for keeping peace on the Korean Peninsula. Sometimes they can turn out to be dangerous. So here are three advice to my Korean compatriot. First, the Korean government should establish a hotline with North Korea as soon as possible to avoid any possible military conflict. Because military conflicts, if not war, always happens out of miscalculation and misunderstanding, but also escalation. It's very worrisome. Second, as I said, it's very disappointing what Kim Jong-un has been doing for the past several years, and I cannot accept it. Nevertheless, do not offend Kim Jong-un and do not humiliate Kim Jong-un's regime. Just try to win hearts and minds of the North Korean people with a long-term perspective. And finally, my advice to the Korean government is that now that you have had Camp David talk to China on North Korea, if South Korea focuses only on trilateral security collaboration, I mean military deterrence, it will strengthen the ties among China, North Korea, and China. I'm sorry, China, Russia, and North Korea. I don't think China has been welcoming the summit between Russia and North Korea. Nevertheless, China can be driven to join the trilateral meetings. If so, it means that we will find a fault line on the Korean Peninsula, which is not good. Now, moving to China, I have some advice to the Chinese government. Former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, who was also a diplomat based in Beijing, advises in his book, The Avoidable War, to these two countries to use diplomatic machinery to make a managed strategic competition. I couldn't agree with him more. In this context, the release of American soldier, Private Travis King, 2 weeks ago, can be a good starting point. The US government expressed its appreciation to China, meaning that China should have played a certain role. This could be a good starting point for a talk about North Korea between the two countries. Now to my American colleagues, my American friends. First, I applaud your role for the peace and prosperity of the world. I also appreciate your constructive role for the maintenance of peace on the Korean Peninsula. However, at this critical juncture, please do not abandon North Korea. Please do not let Kim Jong-un detonate nuclear weapons. As a practical matter, please request the South Korean government to come up with a concrete plan for genuine talks with North Korea to reduce tension and to eventually achieve complete denuclearization. And you talk to China. It will be a good practice for a managed strategic cooperation. It will be a good starting point, as I said earlier, for strategic cooperation and even competition, avoiding confrontation. In dealing with North Korea, again, I reiterate the importance of patience. Patience is the most valuable commodity. Well, this is the end of my advice. Ambassador Cho, you were quite right when you said that we should fasten our seatbelt. Thank you.
Ambassador Joe, thank you so much, but I'm afraid you intentionally did not spend less than 20 minutes. Thank you so much. You saved us more time. Now, Dr. Lindsay, please.
It is an honor to be invited to speak today here at the Kim Dae-jung Peace Forum 2023. I want to thank my dear friend, Paik Haksoon, for moderating today's session. I cherish our friendship. I also will say that when I was informed that I was going to be sharing the stage with Ambassador Cho, I was a bit intimidated. He has a very impressive resume, and I will tell you, it is very hard to be an ambassador at the United Nations. It is a very challenging place to work, so I applaud him for his service. But I will also say, after listening to Ambassador Cho speak, that it's even more daunting to follow him given the quality of the remarks that he just gave, and I applaud you for them, and I agree with them in the main. The forum, I think, has wisely chosen to highlight the challenges facing our hopes for a just and peaceful world. It is a conversation that we very much need to have, and it is my sincere hope that we will continue it beyond today. Now, back in 2017, my former boss at the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haas, wrote a great book with the title, A World in Disarray. His point was both simple and arresting, namely that the world order that had been created after the end of World War II and that had been expanded after the collapse of the Soviet Union was eroding badly. 6 years later, things have only gotten worse. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the lukewarm reaction of much of the world to it highlighted just how far we have fallen from our hopes of a world in which disputes are settled peacefully rather than by force of arms. Now, I see a lot of young faces in the room, so I simply want to say this is not where we thought we were going to be 3 decades ago when the Berlin Wall came down. The early post-Cold War years offered the heady promise of a more peaceful, just, and orderly world. Just think of how the world rallied in 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait. Sadly, that promise has faded. As Ambassador Cho pointed out, geopolitical rivalry and great power competition has returned with a vengeance. The risk of major power war, which was unthinkable for 3 decades, is now ever present. Even if we avoid war, geopolitical tensions threaten a global economy that has brought prosperity to millions around the world, a point I think the next panel will begin to address. Geopolitical tensions are also undermining efforts to mitigate pressing transnational problems like climate change and infectious disease. And on top of all of this, as we heard at yesterday's sessions, artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, and other technological advances pose great benefits, but also pose potentially existential risks. Now, recognizing the perils we face is not to embrace despair. I note that it is a powerful human temptation to think linearly, to believe that current trends will be future trends, that bad things will only get worse. But history often surprises us. And let me offer just one example from the lifetimes of some of the people in the room. When superpower tensions peaked in the 1980s between the United States and the Soviet Union, it looked as if the Cold War would end in armed conflict. But it ended peacefully, and that wasn't an accident. It reflected the power of human agency. Leaders chose wisely. They may do so again. Indeed, I think we should not let our current crisis blind us to the potential to chart a better course. Today's tensions recall those of the Cold War, hence the title of this panel. But as I think Professor Paik pointed out in his opening comments, there are important differences that we should keep in mind, and those differences are striking. One difference is the astonishing connectedness of the global economy. For all of the talk about decoupling and de-risking, economic interdependence is not going to fade anytime soon. Of course, economic interdependence by itself does not make war impossible. Europe learned that lesson back in 1914. But interdependence does create powerful incentives to find mutually agreeable outcomes. So too does the other major difference today from the Cold War. That is the existence of those transnational challenges like climate change and global disease that pose existential risks to humanity. Neither of those challenges will be solved by unilateral action, and no country will escape the consequences of failing to act. The question, though, is whether leaders will heed those incentives. The obvious countervailing force in world politics today is nationalism. It's surging around the globe. Nationalism encourages the belief that others are the source of our problems, that we can go it alone, and that simple solutions exist for complex problems. The fact is, none of those claims are true, especially in a globalized world. But that hasn't made nationalism any less powerful. And the reality is that resurgent nationalism makes it hard to assemble the kinds of coalitions needed to build a more stable order, even in the face of an evident need to act cooperatively. And the every country for itself reaction to the outbreak of COVID-19 is an obvious case in point. Now, many factors, including climate change and new technologies like AI, will influence whether we fall deeper into disarray or succeed in creating a stronger, more just, more stable global order. But the biggest determinant will be the choices that the world's two most powerful countries, China and the United States, make. And here there is deep reason for concern. China insists that it is committed to building a stable and equitable global order that benefits all. However, China's militarization of the South China Sea in the face of international rulings to the contrary, its suppression of democratic rights in Hong Kong, its intimidation of Taiwan, its effort to punish countries that criticize its policies or make choices it disagrees with, and its refusal to oppose Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where the overthrow of democratic governments suggests otherwise. The net effect of China's choices has been to accelerate the forces of global disarray rather than to mitigate them. Now, again, this is not the outcome that the United States hoped for back in the early 1990s after the Cold War ended. 3 decades ago, Washington embraced the policy of strategic engagement with China. That was the idea that encouraging China's integration into the global economy would be good for China, it would be good for the United States, and it would be good for the rest of the world. The expectation was that China would respond by becoming a responsible stakeholder that would work with others to meet common challenges. The belief today in the United States, and I should stress here, it is a bipartisan belief, is that strategic engagement was a grave error. Rather than creating a valued partner, it produced an adversary that threatens the interests and values that the United States and its friends, partners, and allies all hold dear. The equally important conclusion reached in the United States, and again, this conclusion is bipartisan, is that the United States has no choice but to compete with China to maintain a just, free, and democratic world order. The debate in the United States, then, is not over whether to be tougher in dealing with China, but over how tough to be. Now, I think at this point it is important to stress what this policy shift does not mean. The United States is not seeking to contain China. That is not an attainable goal. Rather, the United States is trying to pursue 2 objectives. The first is to limit the economic and technological leverage that China has gained over the United States and other countries by engaging in what was first called decoupling. Now we call it de-risking. The second goal is to create incentives that encourage China to work with the United States rather than against it. And I think Ambassador Cho was referring to this in his remarks, but the overall American approach can be summarized by a quote from Secretary of State Tony Blinken, that the United States will cooperate with China where it can, compete where it should, and confront where it must. To that end, the Biden administration has largely turned away from the Trump administration's nationalist foreign policy. I say largely because I suspect the next panel will note that the Biden administration has kept many portions of the Trump trade agenda intact. The Biden administration has instead sought to rally like-minded countries, like South Korea, to build a consensus on the principles of a global order based on democracy, human rights, rule of law, and freedom from intimidation. I would also note that competition with China has usefully refocused the attention of the United States on the need to address the problems of the so-called Global South, a priority that was all too commonly ignored in recent decades. Now, the intuition behind this approach is straightforward. It's that other countries share U.S. concerns, and that by presenting a common front, you will increase the chances that China will choose cooperation rather than domination. My own judgment is that these efforts are directionally correct, even if words have so far outpaced deeds, and the tone at times has been unnecessarily belligerent. Now, the Biden administration hoped that its efforts to work with others would persuade China to engage in discussions to put, this is a Washington term, guardrails on the relationship that would keep competition from giving way to conflict, and in the end lay the foundation for cooperative action by Beijing and the United States. That hope, sadly, has yet to be realized. China thus far has shown little interest in U.S. calls for sustained high-level dialogue to diffuse tension and to build on areas of potential cooperation, even on topics that are seemingly as straightforward as establishing direct lines of communication between the militaries of the two countries to keep any unintended clash from escalating. China's reluctance to engage reflects a range of factors, including its own daunting internal problems, a desire to get the United States to offer more before China reciprocates, and also the calculation that the 2024 US presidential election could lead to a fundamental reorientation of US foreign policy. That latter point hangs over all discussions about whether the erosion of the world order can be halted. The 2024 US presidential election could return Donald Trump or someone who shares his nationalist views to the White House, leading the United States to turn its back on the world. Such an outcome is likely to accelerate the forces of disarray given President Trump's disdain for multilateral cooperation and his suspicion that America's friends, partners, and allies continually take advantage of the United States. But with all the focus that is being given on whether the United States will choose to remain engaged in the world, the bigger threat may be America's own political dysfunction. I want to recommend to everybody here a recent essay by former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. It's in the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs. Full disclosure, I work at the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council on Foreign Relations publishes Foreign Affairs. And in his essay, which is titled The Dysfunctional Superpower, Secretary Gates writes, at the very moment that events demand a strong and coherent response from the United States, the country cannot provide one. Secretary Gates's concerns are all too real, almost as if on cue to prove his point. Just this week, and for the first time in American history, the sitting Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives was voted out of his chair. This did not happen because the Speaker was accused of a crime or of having acted unethically. Rather, he was essentially fired because he worked to keep the U.S. government operating. No one knows who the next Speaker of the House will be, how long it will take for him or her to be appointed to the position, or whether he or she will have any more success than their predecessor in getting the House Republicans to govern responsibly. So we face the most dangerous world scene in recent decades, with the country that was most responsible for ushering in the most prosperous and peaceful era in world history, either unwilling or unable to resist the growing forces of disarray. It is in a moment, however, just like this that we have to hope for the emergence of leaders in the vein of Kim Dae-jung, who can see beyond what is to what may be and have the courage to act. And I will stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Jim Lindsay. I really appreciate, the exact timekeeping on the side of the both speakers. Thank you for that. I have some questions for both speakers. Let me ask, Jim Lindsay first. The global West and the global East and the global South has become almost a daily balance these days. And you also briefly mentioned global South. And is there any danger that we intentionally or unintentionally turning the world into blocks, political, economic, and strategic blocks, and seek gains, again, political, strategic, economic, and technological. So what do you think? That's my first question. Yeah. And the second question has to do with the Trump factor in the coming 2024 election in the United States. We are all worried about, the possibility that the fundamental reorientation of U.S. policy, not just like because we don't like, Donald Trump's policy or something like that. We are simply worried about inconsistency of the policies of the countries, particularly the United States, the leading country, one of the leading countries of the world. And so, what do you think again in terms of what is the possibility or probability like of Donald Trump comes back and reverses the Joe Biden's policies? Not only the policies of the world, toward the world, but also the policies toward the Korean Peninsula. Yeah, please.
Two excellent questions, Haksoon, and I want to say I really enjoy having a handheld mic because whenever I do it, I feel like I'm Beyonce. So thank you for the opportunity. You asked two very good questions that could lead to prolonged discussions. I have a PhD, so I'm inclined to engage in prolonged discussions, but I realize we have time limits, so I will be short but incomplete in my answer, but hopefully will give you some sense. On the first question, terms are very important for helping us organize the world, to try to grasp some truth about the world as we see it. But terms can also lock us into boxes that prevent us from seeing the world. And I use the term Global South. It's become common. I was recently at a meeting with a number of people from various countries in the Global South, and they all bristled at the notion of the Global South, because if you're in Brazil, your challenges are different than if you're in Kenya, than if you are in Indonesia. And so I think we always have to be careful of just the problem you pointed to in your question, which is that we impose an artificial construction around reality and we miss important things that are happening. My simple point just now in terms of what the United States is doing is I think the United States for 20 or 30 years sort of deprioritized the problems of developing, we used to call developing countries, now we call low and middle income countries, thinking that because of the belief of neoliberalism that markets would solve all problems, and they don't. And I think one of the healthy consequences of the renewed geopolitical competition is taking the problems of the rest of the world seriously in Washington. Words don't match, or deeds don't match words yet, but one can be optimistic. Second, on your question about Donald Trump, again, I have no prediction as a likelihood as to whether he will be elected president in November 2024. Everything I've learned about American politics right now is that they're strange and a lot can happen in 12 months. I will keep in mind that he is facing 4 felony trials. But the point is that he could come back, and I would expect a dramatic departure in American foreign policy for 2 reasons. One, I think because President Trump has been president, he has a better sense of what the power of the presidency can do. He will no longer be learning what a president can do. I think the second thing is that he is going to come into office with a very different team of advisors. When President Trump took office in 2017, he was surrounded by a number of, I'll call them liberal internationalists, people with deep experience in world politics. They may be conservative, they may have been more, or favored a more assertive foreign policy, but they understood the value of allies, the value of friends, the value of partners. I don't think President Trump in a second term would have a similar set of advisors. That first set of advisors was more than happy to say, no, Mr. President, You shouldn't do that. There are lots of stories about decisions the president made that people took the paper and threw it away so that what he did didn't connect. I don't think that'll be the issue the second time around. I do not know what he will do on the North Korean peninsula. And again, if you look at the Trump presidency, it varied from fire and fury. Maybe that's President Trump calling.
This means that 10 minutes are left.
Okay. Okay, very good. So, I mean, one possibility is he'll revert to fire and fury. Another possibility is that he will return to his bromance, if I can call it that, with the leader of North Korea. Another possibility is he may just say, not our problem. And I think that's actually a real distinctive possibility, if he becomes president.
Thank you, Jim. This is sort of an advertisement for viewers and audiences around the world. This session is being live streamed, just like in all other sessions of this forum.
You told me that after I spoke.
There is a very interesting analysis piece by New York Times when we had what is trilateral, U.S., Korea, Japan trilateral summit at Camp David in August, this summer. And the interesting thing was that they talked about, immediate present dangers like, China and Russia and war in Europe. But there is another factor, important factor not mentioned. That's Trump factor. In other words, if Trump comes in and reverses the policies of Joe Biden, and then it's not tolerable in the eyes of Joe Biden. So he wanted to institutionalize trilateral cooperation to the point of no return, no reversing. So that's a very interesting, analysis article.
I just want to make a quick point. I don't mean to preempt the next panel, but President Trump and his advisors have argued that if they come to office, one of their first acts will be to impose a 10% tariff on all goods coming into the United States. I don't know whether they would actually go through with that. Again, you can't always believe what people are speculating about 12 months before an election. But if you were to see that kind of departure in U.S. economic policy, I think it would have global effects as well as being incredibly bad for the United States.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Now, just one question for Ambassador Joe. You mentioned that United Nations is dysfunctional, and the United Nations Security Council in particular is not functioning at all. Members of the P5, permanent 5 of the National Security Council are involved in wars against each other, one another, and there is no passing of any resolution in North Korea, for instance. So not functioning at all. One of the suggestions you gave us today as a policy recommendation was to revitalize the United Nations with genuine leadership. But do you think it is possible to do something to change the function of the United Nations by doing something at the agential level, not at the structural level, when it is totally not functioning at all? Of course, we know the important interactions between agents and structure, but by changing, by introducing good quality, real leadership, UN Secretary General, is it possible to do so?
Well, in the corridors of the United Nations, some doomsayers said that we need a San Francisco moment. That is, we need to have a third world war so that we can have another completely different international organization. That's too much. I don't subscribe to it. I do believe, however, that we can achieve it by having with all due respect to the current Secretary General, we need to have a more active Secretary General, and more importantly, cooperation between the United States and China. You mentioned blocs emerging at the United Nations. They are there, so it is a given factor. So the US should accept the reality that there is the global South, and China should think about its own future in a so-called harmonious way. Only by having this strategic management of strategic relations, we can revitalize the United Nations.
The return of this so-called, even though I said I like it, the return of another Cold War type of international order to Korea and dysfunctioning of United Nations is not only bad for the whole world, but also for Korea. And I'm afraid, that is happening under circumstances. So thank you for all kinds of ideas for constructing a cooperative international system for peace. Let me turn to the audience, and if you have any questions or comments, which should not be brief because we have limited time left, and please. Your speeches are so good enough that there is no questions at all. So thank you for your excellent speeches.
Much like my college lectures.
Let me close this session by pointing out the doomsday clock. Most of you know doomsday clock, created by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, maintained the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. The president CEO of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists was here, Rachel Bronson, and she made a very good, wonderful speech yesterday. And if you go to the homepage of the Bulletin of the Atomic Science, you will see doomsday clock. But do you know, doomsday clock stands at where now? It stands at 90 seconds, 1 minute and 30 seconds to midnight. What do you mean by that? If you move the hands of the doomsday clock forward to the midnight, and then, which means that we are gone. We are total catastrophe in this world. But thankfully, it is still, we have 90 seconds, but this is the closest ever time to midnight. It has never been like this because of the war in Ukraine and climate change and biological threats and nuclear risk and the disruptive technologies. So I think we have to take care of our own selves in the first place and try to think of others in this world, in the rest of the world, so that we can put together our strength. President Kim Dae-jung always said the importance of conscience in action, 행동하는 양심. And Nobel Prize laureate Kailash Satyarthi, who gave us a wonderful keynote speech yesterday, in his keynote speech he emphasized the importance of compassion in action. We were very much impressed by your emphasis on that value. And now I would like to close this session by emphasizing the importance of peace in action all together. Thank you so much.